Hello, everybody, and hello to everybody who's dialed in. We will be starting with the Wacom webinar in a few minutes, waiting for some other people to log in. See you soon. Hello again to everybody who has dialed into the Wacom webinar today. We're waiting for a couple of more people to join in, and we will be starting shortly. Okay, let's get this going. Hello and welcome to this Wacom webinar on a wonderful Wednesday afternoon. Thank you for tuning in and joining us here today. This is part of our Casa Wacom and Wacom Home series of webinars. And we want to use these webinars to introduce you to some inspiring artists and share some valuable but easy to follow tricks, especially now with so many events being cancelled. So thanks for joining us. But before we start, here's some very easy to follow housekeeping. The webinar will approximately be 1 hour with 10 minutes for Q&A at the end. For your questions, please only use the Q&A function of Zoom, so no chat or no raising hands. This way will make it much easier for us to answer. We'll try to answer as many questions as possible at the end. Christina also mentioned that she will keep an eye on the chat during her process. So if it's like really ad hoc related questions to something specifically she's doing at the moment, you might be lucky your questions can pick up. But don't fret, all the questions will be answered in the end. And if we will not be able to answer them during the webinar, there will be an email going out to you guys at the end. If you're new to Zoom, you might want to play around a little bit with the viewing options that Zoom have. So click on the top right corner of where it says speaker view or gallery view. When it says gallery view in the top, you can find a slider between the two windows.
Sorry to interrupt, Jeroen, yeah, but I think there is a problem with your mic. There is a lot of cutting and glitching happening.
Sorry about that, guys. Can you take over, Onur?
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, Jeroen was going about the different view modes. We have different view sections. When you are watching the webinar from above the screen, please feel free to click around different speaker view or gallery view functions. Don't worry, you cannot break anything. Everything will work fine. Just find the ideal view frame for you. We have two screen setup right now. So you will be watching Christina's presentation, and also there's an additional camera where you can see her working on our Wacom tablet during creating her art. By using the slider, you can make sure the window sizes are even and to your ideal preferred position, and it would be basically the correct setup for you. Can go into the next slide. Yes. Who are we? For those who don't know Wacom, we have been around for 35 years. We are creating pen inputs for computers, so you can draw on screen digitally with the native intuitive feeling of pen on paper. We have today our partners from Clip Studio and Christina. Joanna, if you want to, you can just do a quick introduction of
yes, of course.
Celsius. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So Celsius itself was founded in 1991, and you may have heard of Clip Studio under the name Manga Studio before, and it's your all-in-one creative solution for stunning drawings and paintings. It's especially loved by comic and manga artists for its specialized features such as panels and speech bubbles, and it also offers a variety of amazing brushes for artists who like illustrating and designing. And yeah, you can find us under clipstudio.net/en if you're interested. Thank you.
Thank you. And our presenter today is Christina Barton. You know her as ChrissaBug. She's a 2D game artist and animator by day, and a Twitch streamer and an illustrator by night. She has been creating digital art for the past 7 years using mainly Clip Studio Paint. And she is very passionate about drawing cute and expressive characters and conveying emotion through art. So without further ado, let's give it to Christina.
Yeah, hello everybody. So good to see you here, and thanks for the intro. Yeah, I don't know what else to say about myself other than that. Yeah, you pretty much covered it. I work for a small game studio right now as a 2D artist and animator, and at night I also do illustration and I Twitch stream. So today I'm going to go over something that I've been asked about a lot, and that's how I shade my artwork. I don't claim to be, you know, the master of shading. We're all learning, but I do have a very specific way that I tend to go about shading my work, and yeah, I thought it would be a good topic to share with you all. And I'm trying to keep an eye on chat just to make sure I can see everything that's happening, because it kind of disappeared. Yeah, well, I can keep an eye on the questions at least. So let me share my screen with you guys so I can show you what we're going to be working on today. Share screen and Clip Studio. Okay, so you guys should be able to see my screen. If you follow me on social media, you maybe already saw this piece. I did it specifically with this webinar in mind, because I'm also going to be talking a little bit about work from home tips, kind of more near the end of the webinar. But I wanted a really cozy feeling piece to go along with this. So this is like the end result, but I'm going to kind of be going through this sort of step by step from this point, which is just flat shading, and I'm going to be focusing mainly on the character. But this technique, the shading technique, is it's pretty applicable to other things as well. It's not just characters. You could do this. I do this with the backgrounds and with props and all kinds of stuff like that as well. So yeah, let's get into it. So from this point, you know, I've done the line art, and I put in the flat colors, and you can see my layers here, and I do work with quite a few layers, but I just saw a question of hi, what brush do you use? I will be getting into that a little bit later. So because I'm going to show you guys my very favorite Clip Studio brushes, and they are my favorite default Clip Studio brushes, and they're what I use to blend. So I'm excited to show you guys that. So what I have here is just my flat colors. I have a base color, and then all the other colors relating to this character, the eyes, the pants, the shirt, the hair, that is all on separate layers, but I use this, sorry, over here, this clipping, this little button here lets you clip the color to the layer below. So you can see when I undid that, her hair is like all over the place, but I clip these, oops, not the lines, to the layer below. So you're at this point, and now we get into the shading. So to get in, the first thing I do to get into the shading from here is it's not even really shading, it's more of just adding gradients and adding a little bit of life to this really flat character. So I start out by using just a soft airbrush, which is a default. It's a default brush. And the first thing I like to do is I like to make sure I have transparency locked on the skin layer, and come in and just start adding a little bit of gradients. And I usually start with like kind of blush gradients, because blood tends to pool in like the cheeks and the nose and the ears, fingertips, stuff like that. So this is specific to skin, but I'll show you how this also works in other objects like the hair and her clothing and stuff too. So it's just very lightly brushing the soft brush into these areas. And it already makes it feel like she's a little bit more alive. And yeah, this is an older version of Clip Studio Paint. I was just informed of that like right before the webinar started. Joanna was like, is this an old version? Yes, this is. And I'll be downloading the new version like right after this webinar, now that I was informed of this. So oh, what does the clipping function actually do, and how does one apply it? So the clipping function, what it actually does, and I'm taking a little tangent on this because it's actually very important to this part of the process. So I'm just going to turn all of this off for now and show you guys right off the bat. So right now the clipping function is not on, this little button, it's not on for this layer. So let's say I needed to fill in the hair. So there's no clipping function right now. I'm just painting over everything, right? But if I want it to be constrained and only paint in the area that is part of this base layer that I have already painted, I've already gone through all of the trouble to fill this in and make it fit within the lines, and I don't really want to do that again. So all I have to do is paint on the layer above, come up here, turn this on, and then that color is clipped to the layer below. And maybe some of you guys already know that, but it is a really handy tool if you don't already use it very much, especially if you work with lots of layers like I do. What's the difference between clipping layers and lock transparency? The difference is lock transparency, it's very similar, it's just that it's only applying to that same layer. So lock transparency is, I already have, whoops, no lines apparently. I already have this layer right here. If I don't have lock transparency on, this is the lock transparency button. That means I can, color outside. And I turn that on. It's not like I'm clipping back to it if I turn that on now. I have to turn it on later, or sorry, not later, but while I'm coloring. So now it's on. I've already filled this in. And so now it will stay constrained. And maybe I didn't mention this, before, and I should have when I started talking about these gradients. But when you're doing these gradients that I talked about, you need to make sure this locked transparency is on for that layer that you're working on, so that I'm not accidentally painting like a bunch of blush out here when it's only supposed to be on her cheeks, right? So now from this point, I'm gonna move on to just showing you not just skin. I think skin it's a little more self-explanatory, just because we all, I feel like, or at least most of us have been taught like, yeah, like people blush in their cheeks, they blush in their nose. Maybe there's a little bit of a purple that like happens down here, or cooler colors, right? There's usually a little bit more yellow up here. This is all super subtle. You don't want to be going like really, you know, I mean, you could, I guess, if it's your style, to go really extreme here, but at least for what I tend to do, I don't usually go super intense with this step. It's very subtle, just to make everything look a little bit more interesting, even though it's still flat shaded. So applying this to the hair, I usually like to think that at the roots of people's hair is usually a little bit darker than like the tips. I mean, this is really obvious if you have dyed hair, but even if you have natural hair and you haven't dyed your hair at all, this is still, I think this still applies. So usually I will pick the color of the hair, go to that hair layer. Again, you want to lock transparency. Start at the roots, make sure you choose a little bit of a darker color. Start at the roots and just softly brush. And again, this isn't actual shading, it's just adding a little bit of interest. A little bit of variation. Super subtle, super subtle. And then I pick that color again, make it a little bit lighter, and do similar, but to the ends of the hair, right? You don't need to go crazy with this. This step should be like pretty quick. And then for clothing, this is interesting because for like clothes and stuff, you can be a little bit more, I mean, it's up to you how extreme you want to push it. Sometimes I find that actually going darker, like a darker, more intense shade up higher, just looks nicer for some reason. I don't know why, but doing like a dark to light gradient. But then sometimes I do it the opposite way. It's really up to you and like what seems interesting and what looks cool to you. Because you have to remember, this isn't really the shading part. I'm not even paying attention to lighting here. This is just kind of the very first step. Just working on this layer. What is the base color if you cover it up? The base color I just used was her skin color for this one. As far as highlights and stuff, we'll be getting into that a little bit later. There's a lot of questions and I won't be able to, yeah. So a lot of these questions you guys are answering or asking, I will hopefully be getting to them in the upcoming steps. So I'm just gonna keep plowing ahead, okay? So same with the eyes. The eyes you can add a lot of really interesting gradients to the eyes. For some reason, I'm having a little bit of, every once in a while, my shortcuts get like stuck. There we go. I have this shortcut on my pen, just so you guys know, this is a handy tip. I have this shortcut on my pen that I use for this second button here, so that I can scrubby change, is that the word? Change the size of my brush by just holding this down and moving back and forth. I think the shortcut is Control-Alt-Y, left click. Yes, I think that's the shortcut you have to program for this. So some people use the other button for this. You can program whichever you like, but this is for some reason, this is the one I prefer. Okay. Okay. So, I mean, honestly, at this step, we've just added a very small amount of gradients here, but this is really all you need. It's a small step, and I probably spent too long on it. So let's move to the next step. So the next step, oh yeah. So this is after I had worked on it. This is kind of what I came up with. Slightly different, but it's about. This is what I came up with after the gradients. So the next step is adding the hard shadows. And this is what I think a lot of you guys were asking about, is do you put the shadows on a new layer? So yes. And this is what we're going for right now. It's super rough. It's super rough. And I'll show you how to get here. So what I like to do is I like to add a new layer. It's a raster layer. That means like a pixel layer. It's not a vector layer. And then again, this is just on top of that base color and then all the other layers that I want to add this shadow to. And then I clip the layer below. And you can see all of these red marks. That means all of these layers are clipping to this base layer right here. So this is the main, this is like the main this is the main attraction. This is why you guys are here, I think, is the shading part. So what I like to do for this is I usually go to kind of a purplish hue, and I actually go kind of purplish gray, like right in here. If you guys can see this color wheel, like about in here is where I go. But the exact hue doesn't really matter because it's super easy to change and adjust as you go. So you really just need like a purplish gray color. And then I like to go in and use a hard light layer mode. So I'm on this layer that I'm going to use for the shadows, and I make it a hard light mode. Then I go to one of my favorite Clip Studio brushes, and it's just this regular G pen. There is another pen that confused me for a while. It's not the same pen. There's this real G pen, and it's kind of squiggly, and that's kind of nice, but that's not the pen I'm talking about. I'm just talking about this really smooth G pen right here. So from here, you can see already that this is like picking up the colors underneath a little bit. It's like showing through. I know lots of artists will like to use this multiply. I don't really like to use the multiply myself just because I kind of like my shadows to stay colorful. So that's why I use the hard light layer mode for most of my stuff. So from here, again, you're not trying to be super specific. For this piece, I wanted the light to come from like a window on the right. So that means the shadows are going to be over here. And again, because it's clipped, I can just paint over the top, and the edges will stay where I need them to be. And you know, I used to paint shadows and have like a separate shadow layer for each specific piece of, you know, like each color. Like the hair had a shadow layer, and the clothes had a shadow layer, and all of this. But it's so complicated when you do it that way. And I've just started kind of putting them all on one layer, just all of the shadows, one layer. It keeps it simple, and because I use this hard light layer mode, I don't really need to change the color of the shadows when I'm going. It's like, it just kind of works. So just bringing this in. Wow, there's a lot of questions, you guys. Do you use gamete masks for choosing your color scheme, or do you just eyeball it? Usually I just eyeball it. I don't even know a gamete. I don't recognize the term gamete mask, actually. I bet if I saw what you're talking about, I would know what it is, but that's not actually a term I'm very familiar with using. But yeah, usually I will eyeball it, or sometimes I will get inspired for a color scheme by looking at like photography. I really love looking at photos to get inspired. Even like environment photos. A lot of my art is characters, but for some reason I get super inspired by pictures of nature and even though that's not exactly what I'm drawing most of the time, it still inspires me. Actually, I find that a lot of the stuff that inspires me the most is stuff that is completely different from what I do. Oh, and you guys, something that is super handy with Clip Studio is you can see that I'm kind of going back and forth between adding color and then erasing. And I'm not actually switching to the eraser tool. All I'm doing is, I think the shortcut is C, but all I'm doing is I'm switching between, if you can see my little color, my color squares. I'm switching between this first color and the transparent color. That's all I'm doing. And the nice thing about that is it lets me erase with the same brush that I'm currently using to paint. All right. So just adding really hard shadows in here. I'm not like super worried about making them look really nice right now. I just want to get the main big shapes in, the main shadows in, right? Because in the next step, I'll be refining more. I do want to go in here for smaller details like under the nose. I don't know, I find it very satisfying to like, I do find it very satisfying to come in and paint smaller details, but at the same time, it can really slow down your workflow if you start doing that too soon. Especially since a lot of stuff gets painted over anyway later. Right. And something that I've noticed with lighting is, like I said, I don't claim to be a lighting expert, but something that really helps me with lighting, since it's something that I do struggle to wrap my brain around a lot, is not being afraid to look at reference, like photo reference of the same kind of lighting scenario that you're going for. It can really help you out. I mean, there have been times where I have struggled with lighting a piece for hours and hours. And then finally I pull up a piece of photo reference to help me figure out what's going on. And I can fix it in like 30 minutes because I'm looking at reference. I say that, but I don't think I actually I maybe used a little bit of reference for this piece, but I can't remember. I don't think I relied too heavily on reference. So I don't know. Practice what I preach, I guess, and not always what I do. Is this picture your self-portrait? Maybe my inner self. But me in the morning. No, she looks way too productive. I'm guessing, how much time does it take you to complete a drawing? So this is actually a super common question. And it varies a lot. So sometimes if a drawing is really flowing nicely, it can take like 4 hours. I mean, if I'm doing a full like piece. But there are times where it can take, 20, 20, 30, 40 hours. It really just depends on the piece, how complicated it is, and like how naturally it comes. Okay, so I think maybe you guys get the idea. You're bringing in this kind of purplish color, this dark grayish purplish, just using a really hard brush to block in your shadows, right? And then that gets you to here. Actually, it looks like here I had the shadows a little bit of a different color. So I'll show you how to do that real quick. So once you've kind of blocked in your shadows, you might not be very satisfied with the color of your shadows. So there's a really easy way to adjust that. You can go to Edit, Tonal Correction, Hue, Saturation, Luminosity, and then you can play with these sliders to kind of see and change. Like maybe your style is to go for really, really colorful, like pinkish, purplish shadows. I've seen some styles like that. They're super cool. It all depends on, what you want for your piece. Maybe you want really warm shadows. Maybe you want really cold shadows. It totally changes the mood. But this is a really easy way to adjust your shadows to what you need, right? So that's how you do that. And then we get to here. So at this point, we want to like blend these shadows so that they're not so harsh and they're not so messy, right? So we want to get to this point where stuff is a little bit nicer blended. So what I'm going to do here, and this is where I'm going to show you guys another one of my favorite brushes. So I come to this shadow layer that I just painted, and then I'm going to go into the watercolor brushes in Clip Studio. And you can get there just by clicking the B key. You have, your options. Of course, I think this is an old version, but you should still be able to find all of this in the new version. And then these two brushes right here are my favorite. So there's the watercolor brush and the smooth watercolor brush. I will mostly be using the smooth watercolor brush, but there will be times when I want to use the regular watercolor brush because it has a little bit more texture and it's a little less smudgy. Okay. Yes. So let's go in here and do this. And actually, before I do this, I want to show you guys exactly how these brushes look to like just make it obvious how nice they are. So I'm just going to show you with some really different colors. And I'm not going to be transparency locked. There we go. So these two brushes, right now I'm just using a hard brush. But the smooth watercolor brush, it makes a really nice blending effect, like super easily. Like sometimes, like in the past when I have worked in like Photoshop, trying to use the little smudge tool, it doesn't blend so nicely. I mean, you can get custom brushes, I guess, that will help you blend, but nothing has felt quite as nice as the smooth watercolor brush to me, and this is just a default brush in Clip. And then the regular watercolor brush, it lays down paint a little bit thicker, but it also has a little bit of this blending, but there's the nice texture to it. So those are the brushes I'm going to use to kind of blend the shadows. And I'm actually most of the time going to be working with the transparent color swatch. So just coming over this with that smooth watercolor brush, and you can already see how easily it just kind of blends. You do have to be very careful though, because you don't want it to look like too airbrushy and too blendy. That's why it's nice to sometimes pull out this this textured watercolor brush. I actually think that this soft transition is really nice, but if I were to come down here, especially for kind of a cast shadow, I would want it to be not so hard that it looks cell shaded, but a little bit, just a little bit of a harder, more textured edge. So usually when I get to this point, I'm just kind of switching between these two brushes. I make sure I have the color that I used for the shadows. Actually, we changed the color, didn't we? So sometimes I have to bring that back. And this little panel that I'm using down here is just the color history, so I can easily pick past colors. Right? The audio stopped working again. Is the audio working okay? Did it stop?
No, the audio is fine.
Oh, okay. Why don't you use the blend brush in Clip Studio? The reason I use the watercolor brush is because there are times that I want to lay down color. Like right now I am putting down color and blending at the same time. And if I'm going around with just a blending brush, then I don't know. I like that I can do it all. I like being able to do everything with this brush. But I mean, if you love using the blending brush, then like that's awesome, and it can do, you know, the same thing. So yeah, just coming around. When it comes to clothing or objects, this is where you do have to be a little bit more careful, I think, because I don't feel like clothing, the texture of clothing shouldn't really be as soft as skin. So that's why I like to use something like the watercolor brush on the clothing. And you have those bristles, because I really like my works just to have a little bit of texture. Like, yes, it's digital art and you can make it look super smooth and crisp, but I kind of like the roughness that you can get, especially with the tools now. Like sometimes I will look at digital art if someone's been using like watercolor brushes, and it's like, whoa, is that really digital? Like I think it's super awesome when you can make digital art look kind of traditional. Right. Okay. So for time's sake, I'm going to go to the next step. I think you guys understand just going through and, you know, making these shadows that you laid down kind of blend as you go. So then it gets to this step. So from here, I like to, usually this doesn't feel like it's fully shaded yet to me. It feels still kind of flat and almost kind of dead. So I usually like to add another layer of shading, so you can see it going back and forth. There's another layer of shading where I go in and darken. Oops, darken some more. So I basically do exactly the same thing. I make another layer, clip it down, and then for this layer, I'm a little bit more picky about where I'm going to put the shadows. And sometimes I will just start by working with the watercolor brush on this second one. I kind of divided it out for the purpose of being able to show you guys the step-by-step process. But you can kind of go back and forth and do this as you go. So usually the darker shadows are going to be like down here. And you want to think about saving recovery information. Thanks, Clip. Think about like ambient occlusion, and that's where, you know, you get really, really dark shadows in spaces that like intersect and meet, I guess. I mean, that's probably not the best way to describe it, but it's something to keep in mind. If you think about like a 3D render of a 3D model, and it doesn't have any textures, but you see that it's just like this gray or white, and you can see that it's actually not shaded. It just has, it's just defined by the ambient occlusion. It looks super cool, and it's kind of the trick to making stuff look 3D. This piece isn't really a 3D style kind of piece, but you can still use some of those principles to get a little bit more depth to your work. So I'm being very, very intentional at picking, like, okay, the hair is hanging over here. There's a little bit more shadow like in these corners for the second layer of shading, right? Just making it have a little bit more depth, but not going too overboard. Places that I think will be even darker. Like there's this overhang right here in the shirt. Do you work with swatches? I don't usually work. Do you mean like a color palette swatch? I do have this color history, so I know what colors I've used in the past. I don't usually have like a color swatch that I'm always working from. I have before, you know, grabbed some color history, or not color history, but like a color palette that I specifically want to try starting from, but I don't like stick to it through the whole process. I use it at like the beginning, and then most of the colors I'm picking as I go are just already painted in. So like sometimes I'll use something like a color palette at the very beginning that has a very specific color scheme, but I don't like tie myself down to it, because I don't want to like tie myself down if I think, oh, you know, I think this actually could look a lot better if I try just adjusting some things. Like it's cool to start from a place, but also allow yourself to have the freedom. If you think something will look better by changing it, I think that's fine. That's how I work anyway. So just adding in the second layer of shadows. I mean, at this point, it's kind of, this step's a little bit self-explanatory because it's basically the same as the previous one, but you have to be more picky. How do you go to color history? The color history, let's see, this is a pop quiz. Yeah, if you go to window, you have all of these options to pop out some different windows, and there's this color history window right here. Apparently, also you can hit Q on your keyboard and it will pop up. I didn't know that shortcut until just now. But you can also, if you want to work with like color palettes, you can create a very specific color set, and it will just hold it for you. Like you can, they already have a bunch of cool color sets if you want to start from here, but you can also create your own. So if working with color palettes and color sets is something that you like to do, then this is a handy way to do it. without like taking up canvas space with another like image or something. How or where do you get photography for reference? Pinterest. I feel like it's a really obvious answer, but most of the time I will look at Pinterest. I guess mostly Pinterest is for a lot of inspirational stuff. If you are looking specifically for like pose reference or something, then you know, just like grabbing someone's random photo from Pinterest isn't always maybe the nicest thing to do, because lots of photographers and artists' work just gets like randomly pinned to Pinterest with no credit, which is kind of a problem with Pinterest. But it's also, Pinterest is just such a great collection board for inspiration. So it is where I mainly go. It is where I mainly go for stuff like that. Okay, so yeah, I think you guys get the point of this step. So the next step, so we've gone from, this is the flat where we started, and then into this shadows 2 is what I call it, the second layer of shadows. So from here, this next step is going to be super quick, super short, but it's kind of a subsurface scattery thing that I like to do for skin specifically. So pay attention because it's going to take about 2 seconds. But I like to use another layer. You can clipping mask this layer again if you want, but you might not even need to. And then go to like a reddish orangish kind of hue overlay. And for this one, I'm just going to use a soft airbrush. And you're going to find this core shadow. There's actually, you can't even see that there is a core shadow right now because it's just all blended and soft. But where on her skin the shadow meets the light, and just do a really gentle, like, it's actually a little too orange, a little gentle like brushing over of that. So all it's doing, and we're using an overlay mode for this, all it's doing is just making that little like red, just a slightly red tint to where the shadow meets the light part of the skin. But it just adds a little bit of that subsurface scattery type look to that core shadow. It's really subtle. It's really subtle, and you can get away with not doing it, but I think that it does add just a little bit when you add it. So without it and with it, right? So it's super subtle, but it's something I think can really benefit, especially if you're working on like humans and skin. Okay, so the next step is the highlights, which is one of my favorite steps because I feel like it's where stuff really starts to come alive. So let's not work on that. Let's work on this so that I can show you how to do it. So again, another layer on top of all of this. Clip the layer below. I think you're starting to see the pattern here. And then from here, because there's a window coming from the right in my imagination off camera, I'm actually going to make the highlight in her eye kind of window shaped. And I'm going to use, see if I can remember, I think it was a hard light for this one as well. So I'm going to use, oh, you know what? Actually, you don't want to clip this layer. You want to bring this layer on top of the line art layer. So, I mean, if you want, you can just do like the regular little highlights like this in the eye, that works. But since this specific piece has a window in it, I wanted to draw kind of a window shape for this highlight. Right. And for these kind of very specific shapes, whoopsies, I do have to use a little bit of an eraser. Yeah. Okay. It's a very delicate matter. Does the tablet you are using have a keyboard? If not, how do you type the letters? Well, I'm working on a computer, so I do have a keyboard. I do have a keyboard right now that I'm using. Okay. So this is just kind of a very generic window shape. And actually, this brush needs to go even smaller for this. It's a little ridiculous. These tiny details. And it kind of follows the curve of the eye as well. All right. So on this layer, I don't really like the shape of that highlight, but we must move on. So I also, on this highlights layer, I'm going to add some highlights to other parts of the face. And I'm going to do that, I think, with the smooth watercolor brush again. I might switch to like a dense or opaque watercolor, but if this is too soft, but I think it will be fine. You just need to apply a little bit more pressure sensitivity, that's the word, to get a little bit more color out of this brush. So just adding highlights. And again, this is a hard light layer mode. With this light of a color though, it might not actually be picking up any colors underneath. So for the highlights on the skin, moving the color a little bit more saturated might actually help it out. And so just adding these little highlights to the skin. And when it comes to adding highlights to the face, I mean, it depends, obviously it depends on the lighting, but you can look up specific spots on the face that tend to be a little bit more like shiny and catch the light a bit more to help inform your decisions. And then for the hair, I do have a specific process for the hair as well. So for the hair shine, some of my pieces I don't make very shiny hair, but then for some of the pieces that I do, like for this one, I did make the hair pretty shiny. So, but did I really use a hard light layer mode for this? No, I can't remember. I did, okay. Then we will do that. So for the hair highlights, you might have to play around with the color of this because I am trying to remember even how I got that color that I got. But it's easy, I'll show you that it's easy, even if you don't feel like you have the right color right away, it's easy to change. And oh, there we go, that's looking good. So maybe an overlay layer works better, I don't know. You can play around with these layer modes. So for the hair highlights, I like to kind of come in and I don't worry so much about super specific shapes again. Just kind of get the general feel of the light. So the light's coming in like this, get the feel of it coming through, and then again come in and use the eraser to get a more specific shape that you want. and then we can adjust the colors. And for hair, it's kind of fun because like there's you can get really creative with the shapes. The hair is almost like, the hair can be almost like abstract art. Oh. Auto recovery, there we go. And I mean, a whole tutorial, many tutorials can be made on how specifically to draw and paint hair. I mean, many tutorials have been made on that, so I'm kind of just breezing through this, but it's kind of a fun little shortcut. So from here, I am going to switch this to a hard light and then edit tone transform again. And let's just see if we can get this to a color that is a little bit better, a little bit more appealing. So I'm actually going to take this luminosity down and just make it a little bit more subtle. Also the saturation, I think, was a big offender. There we go. That's looking a lot better, actually. It's matching the hair a lot more now. So you can just play with this until you find a color that's looking nicer. So now the actual color that's there is kind of gray, but once you turn on that hard light layer, it fits a lot more. Okay. Okay, and magically we're here. I'm sorry I'm missing a bunch of your questions. I think I'll be able to answer a lot of them at the end, especially the general ones, because there's quite a few. So after this point, you'll notice that I draw, or you'll notice that my line art is kind of brown. It's just kind of the reddish brown colors. It's a color that I like to do my line art and my sketches in for, I don't know exactly why, I just prefer it, but then partway through the process I will change the line art color so you can see the difference here. And the easy way to do that is just to come into the line art layer, make sure this opacity is locked again, or the transparency is locked, and then I just come in with a regular brush. For the eyelashes, I'll make them a lot darker. I don't usually make them fully black because usually you want to avoid painting any sort of pure black or pure white in your artwork. But this is just an easy way to come in and change stuff. And her eyes are kind of greenish. So I'll come in, pick that color. Actually, they're kind of orangish yellowish. It's a little weird. And then make it a little bit darker, just so that the line art surrounding the color matches more. Right. And then I do this with everything. I felt like with this piece, I didn't really need to change the line art that was like on her skin or even her hair. Her hair, the line art in her hair could have been made a little bit darker. But specifically for her shirt, since it's blue, I felt like this brown line art was really, it really like stood out. So I pick up the darkest color that I have shaded here. And then I just, you know, make it darker, maybe a little bit bluer, and then just paint over to change the color of this line art. Right? And it just makes it match and feel, it's totally a style thing, honestly. Like there are plenty of people who draw and do their line art with completely black and it looks amazing, or red or brown or whatever. And it's totally a personal preference and style thing. For my stuff, I tend to do it this way. And so like it's up to you. You can choose like what you like, what kind of look you want for your style, or just your specific piece. I mean, it can change from piece to piece. There's no reason you have to only do it one way forever. Like I think that experimenting and doing things different ways is it's really good and healthy thing. why would you want to avoid pure black and pure white? Pure black specifically, like this all the way down at the bottom of this triangle, is a really it's really dead color, and it can make your work feel very, very static, and it's just less interesting. I'm sure there are other theories behind it, but it is a very common like color theory thing, is when you're doing your art, you don't usually want to use like pure black. And the same is true with pure white. I think pure white does get a little bit more leeway. Like sometimes I'll have some highlights in the eyes that are pure white, but you don't want to make it like a common thing throughout your piece. Okay, so the line art is painted. Right? So I have this like dark blue around the shirt and then this red for the pants. So the next step is kind of a big step that it's not really a step-by-step kind of process for the next step, because it's very much okay, get into the flow and paint over your stuff. So I mean, this is fine. Like I would consider this like, yeah, it could be like almost done. But then usually what I'll do is I will make a new layer on top of everything and actually just come in and start painting on top of everything. So that usually includes like this rim light stuff. So let me kind of show you a little bit of how that goes. And for this step, I do use a custom brush. I didn't make this brush. It's a brush by a guy named Friendon, an artist named Friendon, so credit where credit's due. And it's the same brush that I use for the line art. It's this like Teague's Folly brush, but I'm always kind of jumping around brushes. I do have favorite brushes, but like I'm not afraid to like try new ones out. I'm always interested in finding new stuff that and just seeing how it works with my artwork. So the light's coming from the window, so I felt like she should probably have some like window kind of rim light coming in, so I'm painting on top of everything. This is just no blending mode, it's just regular painting on top of everything. And I'm going to come in and blur this. I think that there is a weird thing that artists sometimes do, and sometimes it works and then sometimes it feels strange. So but when they do these rim lights, especially on like curved surfaces, they just leave a hard line, and with some styles that works really well. But if a rim light is actually on a surface, it's gonna kind of blend a little bit. So I will be coming in to blend this a little bit. But for now, I'm just trying to like lay it in here. I'm actually gonna zoom out. Right. And maybe even put a little bit on the nose. I know that some people think of rim light as a little bit of almost like another form of line art, depending on their style. I don't think that's a terrible way of looking at it. It's I think it can work that way. It's not realistic at all, but it can work. Right. Okay. So from here, going back to the watercolor brush, again, doing the same thing, especially for these curved surfaces. I'm using the eraser, smooth watercolor to kind of both erase a little bit of this intensity and also smooth it out. Okay. And actually, when I'm going through this, sometimes I'll overdo it with this rim light. I'll be like, yeah, actually, I don't think it would be here. And I just erase it completely. And that's fine. Like sometimes I feel like going overboard and making stuff too extreme is better sometimes, because then you can always like pull it back, rein it in as you go, rather than being like way too subtle about stuff. So I used to work as a VFX artist. I still do VFX for part of my job, but I used to work only doing VFX for AAA games, and that was one thing that I noticed. It was way easy to accidentally make stuff too subtle, or you would get feedback like make it more, like make it bigger, make the explosion bigger. And then you like add a little bit and add a little bit and add a little bit, but then it's not enough. It's actually way easier to just like, you know, make the explosion like double the size, double the craziness. And then when someone says, whoa, 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 that's too much, it's like, oh, okay. And then you just like rein it in. And it's way easier to work that way than to be too subtle and always inching up. Yeah, see, I don't like that rim light right there. So that's kind of how it goes when I'm adding rim light. But on this same layer, I'm also going to paint over a little bit more. Usually most of my paint over, I focus on the hair, because I feel like the hair it can feel very stiff if it's just stuck in the line art completely. I feel like hair should be a little bit free to color outside the lines, you know? So, and it doesn't have to be crazy, but like this piece, I feel like this piece of hair feels a little stiff. So I'll just pick this color and kind of just start brushing in some stray hairs here and there. Just make it feel a little more, not realistic, but free, I guess. Not so constrained by the line art. And sometimes I will completely paint over much of the line art. I don't think I ever, there are some pieces where I will completely get rid of the line art, but most of the time I like to keep it just a bit, but I'm not afraid to paint over top of it. Right? And like back here, I felt like, oh, maybe there's some stray hair back here. It just makes it feel a little bit more organic, I guess. Right? And then there are also times where I've done this paint over step and then I pull up some reference and I completely paint over the face. I didn't for this piece, but there have been times. And then I will just like turn this layer on and off to see the difference, and it will be a huge improvement, especially if for the paint over I start looking at some reference because something like wasn't working. Do you think about shadows while making line art as well? For example, thin lines on the side where highlights should be and thick lines on the shadow side. I'm not usually thinking about shading so much when I'm doing the line art. When I do the line art, what I'm keeping in mind usually is just in general, the line weight on the outside of everything should be thicker than the details inside. And then I'm also thinking just about the weight of the line art. So the weight of like how it goes around corners or how it acts when it meets surfaces. I'm not usually thinking about the actual shading at that point. I mean, maybe I should, but usually that's not what I'm focused on when I'm doing the line art. I'm usually thinking about kind of other aspects that would affect the line weight. But that is an interesting thing to keep in mind and try out. I actually would be interested in trying that. I think that sounds like a cool thing to try and depict shading through your line weight in your line art. Okay. So that's just, I mean, this is crazy. This rim lighting is crazy. But you would just go through and, you know, use these watercolor brushes or blending brushes. But for me, I use the watercolor brushes to kind of, you know, take this down a notch and also blend it as you go, right? Okay. Let's move on to the next step. So we're getting close and I'm behind on time. What's new? So my final step, I feel like at this point it's like pretty solid. It's pretty close to being done. I mean, I haven't focused on the background at all for this this webinar because the background was kept very simple. And I thought the character would be enough to focus on for our limited time. But the last thing I do is I add a bunch of kind of effects and gradients to really emphasize what I want to emphasize and add more moodiness. So I'll go over kind of some of the stuff that I like to do and some stuff that maybe you can try. So another layer on top of everything. This is like layer madness here. It's wonderful. Again, I'm going to be using some soft brushes and some of these layer modes again. So you could use a multiply or hard light again. I default like to go to hard light just because I like that it kind of brings all of the colors underneath into it, but feel free to play around with this. So the first thing I like to do is I like to find, again, kind of a darkish purplish color, and you can adjust these. And I don't really want any attention down here, so I'm going to just start bringing this in. And actually that's a little bit too saturated, I would say, but I can always change it. So I want just down here to be darker because I don't really want you to be focusing on that. And I kind of like the look of maybe a little bit of a diagonal here. So maybe just a tiny bit up in this upper right corner, a little bit over here, just a little bit of like vignetting going on, you know? And if you need to change the color, you can always take down the saturation a little bit, right? Okay. And then the window is happening over here. So I'm going to bring in kind of a yellowish, orangish, soft light is going over here. And for this, let's just try an overlay. I think that actually works pretty good. It's an overlay layer. And then something that I do sometimes like to do if I kind of want to pop certain colors, like maybe I want her cheeks to pop a little bit more red and pink. So over top, that's really easy to do. So I just change it to an overlay. Again, red and pink kind of color. I guess it's kind of orangish. And then I remember when I was working on this piece, I just kind of randomly started putting some of this color up here in the hair, and I kind of liked it. So, I mean, sometimes it's fun to just try and pop these colors in other places you don't expect. I think I did the same thing with this blue. I felt like there could be a little bit more variation in this hair, so I just added a little bit of this kind of blue here. It just makes it a little bit more colorful to me. I mean, it does make it more colorful, but it makes it kind of interesting to me, these little effects. Right? Yeah. So it's, in the final version, it looks like I pushed things way more, and I added buttons apparently. But I wanted to show you for the, if you can see, I added a little bit of steam for this coffee mug. I'll show you how I did that. Because again, it's with this same watercolor brush. And for this one, I did use kind of a whitish blue. And I laid it in with, sorry, the smooth watercolor brush. Kind of laid in a general shape. And I know it looks crazy right now, but just trust me, right? But then at this point, this brush is so nice because you can just switch it to the transparent swatch, and then just start erasing and shaping the smoke to a shape that you want, or steam, not smoke. And for smoke, I kind of like to keep the inside a little bit more transparent, and then the outside edges are a little bit more opaque. Okay. And just pushing and erasing and carving. I mean, when I work with this brush, a lot of the time, I'm not exactly thinking about like drawing. Or even painting. I'm kind of thinking like that I'm carving. I'm carving shapes with this brush and the eraser. Or it's not even an eraser, but the transparent swatch. So, yeah, until you're satisfied with something like that. And if it's like too distracting, it's always easy to just take down the opacity, right? Cool. And that's the steps. We are running pretty limited on time, so I wanted to get into the like work from home stuff that I wanted to talk about, and I even prepared a little bit of a graphic for this, but I might be rushing through this so that we have time for questions. So sorry if this is a weird like transition, but at least you can see the kind of steps of the process. But I wanted to talk about working from home, and specifically as an artist. I know that at this point, a lot of us have been working from home, and maybe a lot of you are coming out of working from home, and or a lot of you have kind of gotten used to it. But I think that a lot of artists will continue to work from home because a lot of us are freelancers, or you're an independent artist. So I wanted to talk a little bit about working from home tips, and this is all from kind of my own experience and then my own research. So everyone works a little bit differently, and you can take this with a grain of salt and apply what works for you, because I don't claim to like know everything about the psychology behind all of this. But yeah, let's go for it. So for me, when I'm working from home, and just to give you guys a little background, I work for a studio, and I usually work in the office. But in the past, I worked as an independent artist, and then for the past few months, I've been working from home. So I've kind of like gone back and forth of working in an office full time, work from home full time, work in the office part time, work at home part time, and like so I've experienced kind of all of it. So that's where I'm coming from. For me, when I am working from home as an artist, my goal is to kind of, these are kind of my goals. I want to be productive and maintain inspiration, but also have balance in my life, because I really believe that balance will kind of help. It will help with both of these things, being productive and having inspiration. But I know that as artists, it's very common for us to kind of ignore this. We ignore the balance part. But actually, having balance will help, or should help, with the productivity and inspiration. So I have done my best to kind of separate a few different categories of things that I think help, help you reach these goals, at least in my own life. So starting with the boundaries category, I think setting boundaries is really important, and you may have heard a lot of this that I'm going to talk about, but I want to kind of apply it to artists in particular, or creatives. So the first thing, and I think we've all heard this, and if you look up like any sort of online list of like tips for working from home, every single one of them at the top of the list will say like, you have to make a separate workspace, a separate workspace, because if you are trying to like work on your bed, if you were like on your bed with your laptop trying to like make art and, get client work done, you can maybe do that for a couple days, but it's going to be really uncomfortable, and it's going to interfere with how you perceive that space mentally. And so creating a separate workspace for yourself will help your brain kind of be in the right state for when you're working and for when you are not working, which I know that it's really hard for a lot of us to just not be working, but I'll get into that, but it's very important. So with your workspace, you need to not just make it a separate workspace, and this is easy if you have an office or something, but I understand that if you are in like a really small apartment, maybe this is not so doable. So I've heard some creative solutions, like someone's working at their kitchen table, and what they do is they actually tape like a little box around their work area. So they know in their brain, like when I'm in this little taped box, like I'm at work. It helps create that separation. So for this workspace, you also need to think about being comfortable, because you're going to be spending so many hours working. You need to make sure that you are comfortable, and that way you will not be so distracted. And when it comes to inspiration, you need to do what you can to make your workspace inspiring. So what inspires you, it's different for everybody. I have some paintings of artists that inspire me that I have like on my walls. And I also have some like plants around. So maybe if that like makes you feel good and makes you inspired, then investing in little things like that can really do a lot for you. And yeah, I'm sorry, I'm going to rush through these pretty quick. Whoopsies. So the next thing is minimizing distractions. And this, you'll notice it ties into the workspace thing. Sorry, where's that layer? Oh, there we go. So minimizing distractions. And this is like a lot of, there's so many examples of this. So when you're at work, you're going to need to let your housemates know that you are at work, and like when it's okay to come and like hang out and talk to you, and when it's not okay. Obviously, if you have kids and stuff, this is going to be a lot harder. But it's if you're trying to be productive but you're getting interrupted, every 5 minutes, or you're trying to get into a creative flow and you keep getting interrupted, it's gonna be tough. So the distractions, and there's also other distractions. There's like digital distractions. There's social media. There's the nude, not the nude. Oh my gosh, the news. So many things going on. But when you're working, at least for me, when I'm working and I get into the mindset of, okay, I'm going to be working for 9 to 5. Sometimes I just have to turn all that off, and I have to like schedule that in some other time because I need my mind focused on what I'm doing. So minimize distractions. it's pretty obvious, but hard to do. Clock out. So this one ties into the balance part, right? When you're working from home, if there's not a separation of home and work, it's super duper easy to just like keep working or just stay on your phone checking Slack, or whatever software you use to communicate with your boss and your coworkers and stuff. But it's really important to actually, make it a priority to clock out of work. And, this ties into the distractions things, because if you have distractions, you are going to be tempted to not clock out because you feel like you weren't as productive. So these all kind of tie in together. And okay, routine, schedule and routine. I know as artists that a lot of us feel like, no, like I don't want boundaries. I don't want a schedule. I'm just going to, wake up at 2 p.m. and draw until 6 a.m. I don't know. But and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, honestly. Like you can, choose what your sleep schedule is, but I think what's important is maintaining a regular sleep schedule. So if your sleep schedule is to sleep during the day and work at night, I think that's fine. Just I think what's important is being consistent. There's this myth that I think is perpetuated that as artists we should be like driving ourselves to exhaustion, and that will like help us with our creativity and make us inspired. But I think the opposite is actually true. So I think it's important to prioritize stuff like sleep schedule. And then the next thing is morning routine. Again, this is super, super common stuff, but if you take a bit of time to, prepare yourself in the morning to get ready for work. I'm not saying you have to put on your like jeans or whatever. You can wear pajamas like this girl, but put on a new shirt or something just to prepare your brain for working. Then I think it will really help you out. And also another thing is, the really nice thing about working from home is you have no commute, right? But the cool thing about having a commute is it gives your brain time to kind of make that switch to work mode versus at home and relax mode. So maybe something to consider is maybe you do schedule in a little bit of a fake commute, like a morning walk or something, or whatever jives with you. Maybe you dance, maybe you ride your bike, I don't know, whatever works for you. It's something to consider. It's not something I do every day, but every once in a while, if I go out for a morning jog before work, like I feel so good that day. I feel way more productive and like I can get a lot more done. So it's something to like try out. This goes into the clock in, clock out thing. They're very similar, but I would recommend if you work like a regular job, a regular like 9 to 5, but you're working at home, you should consider starting your job at that same time that you would have started at the office. If you start like letting your day slip and like you start later and later and later, that means you're going to have to be working later and later and later, and it's going to make it really hard for you to clock out. So I mean, really obvious, but something to keep an eye on, because as artists, it's easy to just like push our day and be productive only later in the day. And breaks. I think everyone knows this. Everyone knows we should take breaks from drawing, otherwise you'll get wrist injuries like I do. I actually have just recovered from one. I had one last week. My wrist was giving me problems because I was drawing and not taking any breaks. This is a lot of talking, but I'm trying to get through all this stuff. But breaks are very important, even if they're little breaks, to just like stretch your wrists, or again, maybe go on a walk, because a lot of the inspiration that comes to me for like a new piece or an interesting idea will come to me when I am like out not drawing, when I'm out taking a walk or out like at the grocery store or just like out in the city, whatever it is. A lot of my more original drawing ideas will come from when I'm out like on a break, not when I'm sitting at the computer. Sometimes your brain really needs that space to get it needs the space to like process. It needs the space to like take in your surroundings and process new things to get new ideas. And so I highly recommend I highly recommend the breaks. I should take more of them, to be honest. Communication. This one, again, another really obvious one, but if you are working with your boss or coworkers or clients, especially, I mean, I was going to say especially clients if you're a freelance artist, but really everyone, you should be like over communicating. You can never be asking too many questions. If you get a commission from somebody, you should ask as many questions as possible about that commission to get all the info that you need so that people are happy with the final result. And then if you're working with your boss and coworkers, check in, make sure they know that you're being productive at working. If you suddenly if you're working from home but you're not communicating, it can make employers hesitant to. It makes people worried. It makes people worried, and it also. You just need to make it easy to get in touch with. So I think this is very important. I think that we probably all know this, but sometimes it's easy to just let it slip. Oh, okay, loneliness. This is a big one. So combating loneliness while working from home. I know that maybe there's a lot of artists who are like me, and we're actually very introverted, and I've actually been pretty okay working from home and not talking to anybody, but I know that a lot of people are struggling with this, the loneliness of just working in your office, at home, or in your bedroom, or wherever, day after day after day, not hardly talking to anybody except maybe your cats. And yeah, so loneliness. There are some ideas I have for this. So finding a community online can really help with this. Some people watch YouTube videos, some people listen to podcasts just so they can hear kind of a voice going on in the background. I actually run a Discord server where there's always a group of people in there chatting in voice chat as they're working on drawing. So finding a community of like-minded artists, if you want to connect and talk to someone, it kind of feels like you're, in a room with them while you're working. And I think it can really, really help with this, the loneliness problem. Can you post your Discord server link? My Discord server link is available through, you can check out my Instagram or Twitch, and there are links there. Okay. This is a little bit more of an abstract one. I'm sorry if I'm rushing through all of these. I just want to make sure to touch on everything. But self-talk. This is a very personal one for me because it's something I do a lot, and sometimes I don't even notice that I'm doing it. But if I find that I am struggling specifically with this productivity part of the goal here, sometimes using self-talk can really help me out. And I'll give you a silly example, but seriously, I do it all the time. And it might not work for some people. Maybe it will work for you. I don't know, but it's something to try out, I guess. But for me, if I find that I have not been very productive, or my goal is to be more productive for the next, couple hours or whatever, I will actually say to myself, okay, Christina, you're going to be really productive. You're going to tune out all of these distractions and you're going to be so productive right now. You're going to be so productive. And I know that sounds really like cheesy. It sounds really silly, but I'm telling you, it really, it helps me like focus my mind, hone my mind in, and like sit down and work. And I just tell myself that a couple times before I sit down to get to work again. Usually it's good to do after like a break. So take a break if you have been struggling with the productivity for the day, and then come back, get your mind focused, and give it a try. I know it sounds silly, but I thought I would throw it in there because it's something that I really do all of the time. So yeah, those are the main things, but I really breezed over them. Can you please tell us what's the custom brush you use for the line art and the final shading over the layers, please? Can we find it on Clip Studio to download? The brush I used for the line art is the same brush I'm using right now. It's the Teague's Folly brush, and it's actually a custom brush by Friendon. The brush I used for the shading is a default brush. It's the watercolor brush and the watercolor smooth brush. But yeah, I guess we can move on to questions since I made it through the content that I had planned, and I'm sorry it was so much talking. Is over detailing a drawing a bad thing? It's not a bad thing. It's I would not call over detailing a drawing a bad thing, but it can, if it's distracting from the main purpose of the drawing, it just depends on what your goal is. If it distracts from what you want people to focus on, then maybe you don't want to over detail certain parts of the drawing. But if you want people to focus on, you know, the face, maybe you add more details into the face. It totally depends on your goals. Okay, there's lots of questions. So maybe what would be the best way to handle all the questions?
Well, actually, most of the questions were addressing about your technique and how you use the Clip Studio Paint. And
Okay.
I think you automatically answered a lot of them
Okay.
during your explanation process. But there are still some interesting questions. One question you likely touched, but this is something that we hear a lot in our other webinars as well. Like, how do you create your color palettes? How do you choose the right color for shading, highlights, and pretty much everything about your art?
Okay. So I did talk a little bit about this, but I can expand a little bit more on it. So when I am choosing color palettes, the only time I really use a full-on color palette would be at the very beginning stage of my process. So let's actually go to that. So at the very beginning stage, I wanted this to kind of have a soft sort of morning look. And I actually didn't really have a specific color palette for this piece, but I sometimes will go somewhere like Pinterest or something, and it's an interesting exercise actually. If you go to Pinterest or just Google and you search like interior design color palettes, or you search like color palette with blue and blah, blue, like morning color palette, evening color palette, you can find so many already pre-made color palettes based on a photo. And that is something that I do sometimes, but the only time I actually use it is at the very beginning of the process. And then from there, if we already went over the shading stuff, I actually use the layer modes for the shading. So it's not so much picking from a color palette when it comes to that. It's more just using the layer modes and kind of a purplish grayish typically. So maybe I'm a cheater. Maybe I'm a cheater that I sometimes just pull color palettes from online.
Another question was about how do you draw hands so perfectly?
practice. No, actually hands are tricky. I still have to use reference a lot of the times for hands. Not always, but hands are something that comes up, especially if they're in a weird pose that I'm not used to. I will take a picture of my own hand doing whatever pose and use it as reference if I have to. Oh, also there is a really cool thing in Clip Studio that I have used as hand reference before. I'll show you guys. So if you open up the material palette thingy, you can go to the 3D section, and they have a whole section for hands. It's amazing. It's amazing. So there's all of these hands in different hand poses, and they're 3D. So let's just choose a basic hand. And you can drag and drop it into your canvas. Wow, that didn't actually pose the hand, but you can pose it to what you want. I don't use it all the time, but it is something it is something you can use, and I've used it for drawing a hand before. I specifically came in, posed this hand to what I want, and then drew over it because it was really like a pose that I just could not get. And I think that's like, it's fine to do that sometimes. If you're really struggling with something, you can use a photo or these cool 3D models that are already in here. And it's a really neat feature.
This actually sounds really handy.
Yeah. Oh, gosh.
Pun unintended.
Uh-huh.
There was an interesting question about your warm-up routine. Like, is there any specific shapes, doodles, or just going over a favorite drawing that you do during your warm-up?
Yeah, so warming up, well, first of all, I think that not just like drawing warm-up, but before you even start drawing, I think that it is really important to just do some wrist stretches, especially if you are starting to draw like in the morning. In the morning, like all of our joints are super stiff, right? So doing some wrist stretches, and then the actual warm-up routine is typically what I do is I don't really pay too much attention to what I'm actually drawing. Like sometimes it's really just about getting your hand moving, and sometimes it is. It usually just starts with some really, I mean, I'm just scribbling. Oops. So, and then from there, I mean, my automatic go-to is just like a head, you know. I'll just start doodling a head, even if it's bad. Usually I end up erasing stuff. And that's fine. It's really just about getting your hand moving, and then from there, sometimes I'll go into just drawing super simple, like just like kind of stick figures. Like it doesn't even matter what it looks like. It's just to get your hand moving. So it's usually pretty bad. It's pretty bad, but it's, I mean, it's fine. Like no one will ever see that unless you give a webinar and someone asks this question.
Thank you. Also, I really want to thank you for talking through your work from home mentality and routine. I think it really helps to see and hear that most of the problems and most of the struggles are common for all of us.
Yeah.
And I'm sure each person can give the same advice to another one, but it really helps to hear it from someone else. So right. I completely agree. Self-motivation is super important, but also it helps to hear from someone experienced like you to remind some of those basic facts.
It's, yeah, I don't know. I mean, all of it seems pretty like we probably already know, but it's not, but we don't always practice, right? I do think that the clocking out thing is very important. It will keep you fresh. if you have time away from the computer. Yeah.
Going through the questions, we have a lot of brush-related questions.
Okay.
But you actually explained in detail multiple times about your preferred brushes and how do you use them.
Yeah. Yeah, hopefully I answered. I can give a super quick, like, my favorite brushes are Clip Studio's default G pen for hard lines, and watercolor brush for blending and a little bit of texture, and then the smooth watercolor brush for blending. And then the line art brush that I'm using is the Teague's Folly from, it's a custom brush from the Friend and Art Pack. Those are my favorites.
Right. I think we have covered pretty much everything and we are still on time.
Okay, good. Cool.
Okay, now I will take over and share my own screen. Let's hope Zoom will share the correct screen.
Make sure both of your screens are blank.
I think you have to stop screen sharing.
Oh, me? Okay.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay.
Oh, now I'm seeing all the chat. I was totally missing it.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for attending. Christina, thank you so much for going through your art and also explaining and talking about the working from home transition and mentality. It's really helpful to hear all of those things. Please do follow us on social media at Wacom. You can find us on pretty much every common social media platform. And when you are sharing your content with us, please don't forget to tag with #MateWithWacom. Don't forget to follow our presenter at ChrissaBug and our partner Clip Studio Paint at Clip Studio Official. We have a special discount code for you all. If you use the code WebinarChristina during your checkout on Wacom eStore, you can get a 15% discount on Wacom Cintiq 22, the tablet that Christina was using today in our session, a Wacom Intuos Small or a Wacom Intuos Pro Medium. The deal is valid until June 11, so you have only 1 week. Thank you all again. And Jonah, if you want to have some closing remarks as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Christina, for taking the time to do the webinar so in depth. It was great watching your process, and I'm sure like you have a Twitch channel as well, so people who might have missed some of it could probably follow you there and get some more advice there as well.
Yes,
and
I stream on Fridays if any of you guys want to join me.
So very soon already.
Yeah.
And I believe this webinar is also going to be online for people who missed it or who missed part of it. So it will be up on the Wacom channel.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, and thank you very much for having us as a partner. And I thought it was a really great webinar.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It was fun.
Thank you. Thank you all. One last reminder, everyone, you will receive an email within the next 24 hours where you can find all the necessary information and links to Christina's different social media platforms, her Twitch channel, her Patreon account, also to Clip Studio Paint, and also our Wacom own channels. So keep an eye on your inboxes and hope to see you again in our next webinar. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.